Wild strawberries. In Swedish, Smultronstället. Meaning a strawberry patch, but also a secluded place of profound nostalgia. Rewatching it gave me a nostalgia for a bygone era. There was a time when an eminent medical doctor like Isak Borg would light up a massive cigar with his pregnant daughter-in-law Marianne sitting right next to him, smoking a cigarette. A time when eager college students would get into fistfights over arcane theology. A time when it was still safe to pick up hitchhikers.
I'm Erin Brown.
I am Sila Blume.
I'm Eric Trommater, and this is World Cinema History. Continuing our series on aging and mortality in 1950s cinema, we travel from the bureaucratic Japan of Kurosawa's Ikiru to angst-ridden Sweden for an existential road trip with Ingmar Bergman and his 1957 film, Wild Strawberries. Unlike Ikiru, it's built on dream sequences and not always reliable flashbacks. Some are nostalgic, some are horrifying. Like Ikiru, it's a meditation on what it means to truly live versus simply being alive. Erin, this is your first viewing. Give us your opening thoughts on Wild Strawberries and any experience that you had with Ingmar Bergman.
I think it will come as a surprise to no one that I hadn't seen an Ingmar Bergman film before this, so I didn't know what to expect. I've seen parodies, people making fun of it, so I wasn't sure if death was going to show up and play chess or what, and especially with that dream sequence at the beginning with the hearse and the clocks with no hands, stuff like that. I really wasn't sure what to expect. It was a lot more straightforward and less weird than I thought it might be.
Sila, what were your opening thoughts on Wild Strawberries?
I've seen it now for the second time, and I remember it very differently. I like it a lot more now than I ever did before. I always thought, I don't know why that is such a popular film from Bergman. I don't understand why people don't get some kick at the age of 5, 15, instead of waiting and suddenly be enlightened by a young woman with her 2 boyfriends and your daughter-in-law. And I just find very tragic that this person has in some ways wasted 70 years to come to appreciate and enjoy so many things that have always been around him, because he's actually a respected person and has had a wonderful family, but for some reason it took him too long to open his eyes, and now he's doing that. Now he's having nightmares, and now he's even a little bit trying to seduce his maid. I do not understand why humans do that. I'll leave it there for now.
Yes, it's very much of its time. It's a very straightforward narrative, and the exposition can actually feel quite quaint compared to later, more complex works, say, Buñuel, Antonioni, Fellini, or even later Ingmar Bergman. Could it also serve as a harbinger of those innovations, like a halfway point in narrative movie making? An evolution in the exploration of the subconscious? Perhaps. But outside of its historical importance, I still found the film deeply moving. Tagging along with Isak Borg on his long trek from Lund to Stockholm to receive his academic award was just as meaningful a journey as it had been almost 40 years ago when I made the ride with him the first time. Time has not been kind to the narrative style of the film, however. Bergman still has to spoon-feed the audience in a way that may feel patronizing, at least to most modern audiences who are now used to drawing their own conclusions and connecting their own dots. Still, the insights on this road trip remain as deep and as vital as they were in 1957. The questions it raises are just as revealing, and the answers it gives are just as profound. The films in this series are part of the classic literature of world cinema. They're essential viewing. Side note here, it really doesn't matter if these pictures work for their viewer, or even if people like them or not. Does it matter if you like reading Melville? Does it matter if the characters in Henry James are sympathetic? No. No, it does not. Now, nothing is beyond criticism. We can point out the flaws in these works. We can deconstruct their meaning. We cannot ignore their impact. I'll get off my soapbox now, but Erin, is there a work you feel similarly about, one you respect and know is important, even if it's a difficult or challenging watch for you personally, or perhaps one you feel hasn't aged particularly well? By the way, John Gilman is not an acceptable answer.
Okay. For me, I think it would have to be pretty much anything by David Lynch, which probably sounds bad, and especially since I've only sat through 2 of his movies. I know he was influential and important for a reason, but his work does not work for me. It's just not, it's too unsettling and disturbing, but it's great that other people like it. And I'm not going to tell anybody that it's crap or not to watch it. It's just not for me.
To me, that's a very unusual question, but thankfully you mentioned one that I will steal from Erin. I really love Lynch. I really love what he did with The Straight Story. I always forget it was The Right Story or The Straight Story. I absolutely love The Elephant Man, but a couple of other films, well, Eraserhead, I think I could, it's okay. But my first years watching David Lynch, I would put it in that category. What's the title of, because there's 2 titles, one in Germany was used and the other one that was used here. What was the name? Laura Dern and
Wild at Heart.
Wild at Heart. I watched that film in Germany with my girlfriend of the time, and after 2 or 3 weeks, we noticed that everything we talked about, every party we went to, every conversation we got involved with, we kept putting down the film. We kept saying how bad the film was. And after 3 weeks, I said to her, actually, this film must be very good because we keep talking about it. So I probably would say...
That's a perfect example.
Yeah, I would probably say that. So
I think later Godard films are a bugaboo of mine. I often talk about how I struggle with Tarkovsky films, and even the films of one of the directors we'll be covering next week, Robert Bresson. Here's what I'm asking, is that you can struggle with these films and still acknowledge them as great works of art and still acknowledge what other people see in them.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to like it yourself for it to be great.
Bergman started his filmmaking in the 1940s, and his 1950s output would be enough to have enshrined him in almost any director's Mount Rushmore. And 1957 was an incredibly productive year, with 2 features still considered essential cinema. This film, Wild Strawberries, and The Seventh Seal. And this capped a decade of breakthroughs that included The Naked Night in 1953, which is also known as Sawdust and Tinsel in Britain. Its original title was Night of the Clowns. And his big international success in 1955, which was Smiles of a Summer Night. These are all considered essential cinema, and even if you've never seen a single Ingmar Bergman film, as Erin pointed out earlier, you've seen The Image of Death and Max von Sydow playing chess in The Seventh Seal. Erin, considering this is your first time seeing a Bergman film, what struck you most about his style?
I think his use of light really struck me. There's at least one scene where our protagonist was laying in bed, and with the light shining right on his face, it felt like he was in a coffin. And with the clocks in the background constantly ticking, there's a lot of existential dread. It's like he knows he's going to die at some point. We don't see it happen in the film, as far as I know, unless I missed something important at the end. Don't think that I did.
You did not.
Good. I'm glad I didn't misinterpret that he just went to sleep. The way he used light to kind of partition him off, the main character, from everything else. And also the symbolism in the dreams, but we'll be talking about that later, won't we?
Seeing as this was your first Bergman film, did this feel like something like a fully realized work by an existing master, or did you view this as an early film in the evolution of a filmmaker while you were watching it. Could you tell this was something by someone who hadn't had a ton of experience making films, or did you feel perhaps the same way that people in 1957 felt that they were watching a fully realized masterpiece by a great artist?
It was definitely its own standalone piece by someone who knew what they were doing, but it also had some things about it that I felt like were not as necessary as maybe he thought they were. The narration, for the most part, I feel like a lot of what he did with the narration he could have accomplished just within the actions of the characters and what they were doing. That
he
felt
spoon
odd.
feeds a lot of information.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Isak Borg sitting under a tree, gazing, looking nostalgic, and things like that a modern audience doesn't need in films anymore. That does seem like a holdover, doesn't it, from previous time?
He could have done without all of that. I don't know if it would have made it a better film. Probably a little bit. It was still good as it was. It still got the point across and was still a good film.
I think I've seen maybe 20 of his films, and I think he did well over 60, 70. Scenes of a Marriage, to me, is a profound, profound piece. And that's just naming one film. Cries and Whispers, Wild Strawberries. I have learned to appreciate cinema on a very different level in the last 3 years, and a lot of it started with Bergman.
Well, one of the hallmarks of all Bergman films is his ability to capture faces. And the face at the center of this film is Victor Sjöström, which is spelled Sjöström. As Dr. Isak Borg. But it's a beautiful, aged, and expressive face. And it's a canvas, the entire picture. Sjöström was one of the giants of Swedish cinema, a famous director in his own right long before Bergman. And not only in Sweden, he directed classics like The Wind during his time in Hollywood, where confusingly he was known as Victor Sjöström. But it's Sjöström who I feel allows us to sympathize with Borg, who, let's face it, is a rather cold fish with a grumpy disposition. And Erin, this is something we talk about a lot as being the difference between these European films that we're looking at and Hollywood. The willingness to create a more complex, less likable character at their center. How much were you able to empathize, if at all, with Isak Borg, and how much of that had to do with the writing and how much of that had to do with Sjöström's performance?
I think Sjöström's performance is why I was able to sympathize with Isak Borg, because he was, the way it was written, he was kind of a jerk. And honestly,
well, he introduces himself as a pedant.
Yeah.
Which knowing your love of pedantry, I was like, Erin's immediately going to hate this guy.
I didn't hate him. That's the thing, is I really didn't hate him. I thought that he was a flawed character, but I think the way that it was presented, you could get a feel for who he wanted to be, as opposed to who he actually presented himself as. All the descriptors of him as being cold and ruthless, and that wasn't how I saw him acting for most of the film. And especially when they got back to his hometown and the gas station attendants wanted to name their baby after him, because apparently he did a lot of good when he was there. So that's the guy he really was, but the guy that lived in Lund was a different version of him.
You liked the reflective man at the end of his life, but the life that he was reflecting was unlikable.
Yeah, pretty much. I feel like he was a decent person at heart, but didn't. I don't know why he acted differently than what it looked like he really felt, but who knows what happened throughout his life to cause that. So yeah, I think that he could have been a much
when
more...
we get into analyzing what the dreams and the flashbacks mean, perhaps we'll get a better view of what created Isak Borg.
What's the name of the actor?
Victor Sjöström.
This is the only time they worked together. They spoke about it. He was very reluctant to speak with him because he was a big, big figure as an actor and as a filmmaker. This is actually Bergman praising Victor Sjöström. There are certain things he didn't like about this actor. He said that he tended to overact. He didn't like that.
And he was a grumpy, combustible 79-year-old man who couldn't remember his lines.
This guy was, I think, 78 at that point. So you never know how long you have left with him.
The beautiful lined old face.
I wouldn't use the word beautiful, but he's very good. He's a very good actor, very, very full of gestures with his face, and his presence is very special.
But we talked about the face in front of the camera. Now let's talk about the man behind it. Ingmar Bergman's output was professionally prolific, but it was fueled by a personal life that was chaotic and to some even scandalous. He had 9 children with 6 different women, frequently his much younger leading ladies. More troubling, he admitted to Nazi sympathies in his childhood, which he blamed on being raised by a conservative, authoritarian pastor father, and he was only dissuaded after the revelations of the Holocaust. Actor Stellan Skarsgård added fuel to this fire in July of 2025 when he said about Bergman, and I quote, "He was a Nazi during the war, and the only person I know who cried when Hitler died." In the same interview, he called Bergman manipulative and said he wasn't nice as a person. He also claimed he didn't feel safe with Bergman around his own wife on set, although he didn't detail what that meant. To be clear, the adult Bergman was very much a man of the left and an outspoken social democrat. He spent much of his life publicly working through his guilt over the Holocaust. His tendency to fall in love with his young, beautiful leading ladies remained a lifelong habit for which he never did apologize. Bergman remained a lightning rod for scandal for most of his career, even having to live in tax exile. While to some, Bergman's personal life is a disqualifying factor in judging his work, my marriage barely lasted 7 years, and both my children were raised in a broken home. Thus, I tend not to throw stones. But this goes back to a subject you and I talk a lot about here on World Cinema History, Erin. Can we separate the art from the artists? Now, I'm on record as saying terrible people make great art all the time, but Erin, you've been very outspoken about not wanting to financially support, say, artists who have political beliefs that are harmful to marginalized communities or have engaged in abusive behaviors. But monetary support aside, are you able to enjoy works by artists who have led less than stellar personal lives?
No, I don't want to financially support artists that use that money to harm other people. Like, I used to love Harry Potter, but I can't stand it now. And even when people are like, you can read the fanfic and that's not contributing, I'm like, I can't. It's ruined for me. Knowing that I thought this person was a certain way, and then it turns out they're not, and they're actually horrible, kind of ruins things for me quite a bit. So I can separate the art from the artist if the artist is already dead. So that I'm not financially supporting them. I can do it if they're from a different era. Like, I had somebody say, what about Caravaggio? He was terrible. I'm like, yeah, but his art was great and he's dead. So he's not benefiting from me saying that painting is great. But people who are still alive and can use the money that they get from you to fund terrible things, or they get away with terrible behavior, like if they're abusive people and watching their films helps them continue to be abusive, I can't get behind that. But once they're dead, once they can't benefit anymore, then it gets easier. It depends on the person a lot of times. Yeah, so if it's somebody that I knew of in my lifetime, that was alive during my lifetime, and I knew about them and found out what they did after being a fan, then I really hate them. So it's complicated.
I have just this assumption that anybody who creates anything I like is an asshole in their personal life and probably holds political views that I oppose. And I'm actually usually surprised when they're not, they don't.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to do it, because you've got people out there like, say, David Tennant, who actively, vocally supports the trans community. You don't want to find out that he's done something terrible in the past, because, like, he keeps coming across as this really awesome guy. I don't want to be disappointed to find out that he's not. So far, everything points to David Tennant's a good dude. That's sort of a don't meet your heroes situation. I don't want to know if somebody's a terrible person if I think they're great.
Now, when it comes to Bergman's early Nazi stance, obviously he came out of a very conservative Protestant minister's home, and the rise of authoritarianism versus what they saw as the breakdown of European values under communism and things like that influenced him. The Holocaust woke him up, and he became a person of the left, and he spoke repeatedly throughout his adult life. And in his work, not his best work, but works like The Touch and The Serpent's Egg, he came face to face with Sweden's own complicity in the rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. There's a lot in the social media verse about Stellan Skarsgård's comments recently where they're trying to cancel Bergman, but how are people allowed to grow And how are we to prevent the uprising of the next Nazi movement if we don't allow people who maybe were sucked into elements of the far right to grow out of that position and still take a place in society?
No, I think we have to allow people to grow because people can change. I mean, I can say for myself, up until about 10 years ago, I was pretty conservative. I've learned a lot in the past 10 years. I'm not that person anymore. And I think you can get past a lot of the bad beliefs of your upbringing and become a better person. And I think we need to give people the grace to do that.
And I think that takes us nicely to the other IB, Isak Borg, because that, I think, is the whole theme of the narration of this film, which, clunky as it is central to understanding it. This is an old man reflecting on the mistakes he's made in his life that has led him to become a cold and isolated person. Just as I can look back and say, well, I needed to give Bergman room to grow from his youthful infatuation with Nazism, as evil as that is, I need to give Borg a chance to grow even though he's 75 years old, or well, he could even be 78 because he's going to celebrate his 50th Jubilee. It is, I think, fascinating that when you talk about I did like Isak Borg, or I could at least empathize with Isak Borg, I think I empathize with his guilt and his ideas of what formed him more than I would the actual grumpy old man who says some extraordinarily sexist things to his daughter-in-law, Marianne.
That phase suddenly has so very much about experience, about tenderness, about an old man's sadness for lives going away. I think it's the most one. And I love this man.
Did he live to see the film?
I think 3 months later he was very ill, and I don't know exactly if he saw the picture.
Erin, was that something that allowed you to empathize with him, or did you actually empathize with the old man in his own isolation?
He was isolated, but he had isolated himself. He's reflecting back on that, and towards the end, it's like he was starting to change and try to be more like the person he intended to be as a child. Because it's never too late to change. You know, as long as you're still on this side of the grass, you can change and you can improve. And I think that's ultimately what he was trying to do.
And we can tie this back into the other IB, Ingmar Bergman. It's an almost universal claim among critics that Bergman's male protagonists are somehow his alter egos. It's become the consensus. All art is now autobiography. Borg is an avatar for Bergman's guilt and isolation, period. End of story. Nothing we can debate. Or can we? This flawed man, this Isak Borg, the IB of the film, is honest about his flaws through his narration and through the subconscious revelations. So this autobiographical stream gives the idea that Bergman created this almost as a confession about himself. But Borg is cold and publicly shy, whereas Bergman was quite charming and warm, at least in his public persona. Borg seems to be very unlucky in love. Bergman was actually a notorious womanizer. I mean, perhaps Woody Allen considered him as a mentor in more than just filmmaking. I'm just saying. Erin, I'm on record as finding this critical tendency to view all art as autobiography, especially with somebody as prolific as Bergman to be lazy. Do you share my frustration with every film needing to be seen through the singular lens of a director's personal life, or every author's novels somehow reflecting on them? Or can characters actually be creative enterprises?
Yeah, I don't think that everything has to be autobiographical. Honestly, as a writer, I know I put some of myself into my characters. That's just part of writing, and part of acting is finding what part of yourself can relate to the character you're playing. But it doesn't have to be strictly autobiographical, because, I mean, how could you write horrible characters if that's not what you really like? I mean, in Schindler's List, if Ralph Fiennes had really identified with Eamon Gareth as like part of who he is, how scary would that be to be around Ralph Fiennes, you know? It's not, you're not playing yourself, you're not writing yourself, you're creating art, and it can have bits and pieces of yourself in there, but what serves the story you're trying to tell? It doesn't have to be strictly your own experience. Your experience and your personality are going to flavor it, but that's not entirely what it's going to be. I think it's kind of lazy to say that that's all art comes from specifically your own experience. I think that's very limiting. I don't think it really takes imagination into account very much.
Well, and especially in film, because performance is such an important part of film. And so you are discounting the ability of the actor to create a character by just saying, the actor has become an avatar for the writer and the director.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The actor's performance as Borg was what made him sympathetic as opposed to the writing of the film. I mean, he wasn't written to be a sympathetic character, but the way he played the character, you couldn't help but empathize a little bit with what he was dealing with.
You kind of want him to be a sweet little old man, and when he isn't, it's surprisingly effective.
It's interesting. It's kind of jarring when he's not nice because he looks like he should be. And based on the narration, it feels like he wants to be, but he's not. And he's learning that on this journey. He's learning how it's affected his son as well, which is another reason for it to change. I thought it was kind of sweet at the end when he was talking to the housekeeper about wanting to go by their first names. And she's like, nope, that's not proper. I'm not going to do that. But it was just part of him trying to be more open and softer and warmer.
And Sila Blume, how much of the Ingmar Bergman do you see in Isak Borg? They're both IB, so there's that.
Yes. That's a point that it was made to him in an interview. He said, no, it is not about him. But he added, of course, there are certain aspects that could be personal, but generally speaking, this film is not about himself.
Now, one of the subjects that we've been talking throughout this about is the kind of narrative clunkiness of this in comparison to Bergman's later works. You mentioned Cries and Whispers was among your favorite films of all time, and we're both huge admirers of Bergman's persona, where we have surrealistic dream sequences that aren't introduced with I had a dream where, and we have flashbacks that aren't introduced with someone looking off wistfully. Sometimes those whimsical moments do feel a little awkward, but they're beautifully filmed. As somebody who considers themselves a fan of Ingmar Bergman, were you able to see in this earlier work some of the hallmarks of his later narrative films?
I would say this is a less sophisticated, less avant-garde, less investigation in his language is going on here than later on.
Do you think that is a result of Bergman being a less sophisticated filmmaker at this time, or the audience that he is making the film for not being as sophisticated as later audiences?
I think that happens to anyone, even though we have some artists, composers, filmmakers who have done incredible pieces at the beginning of the work. But for the most part, at some point, you're going to get stronger in your language. You're going to discover your language. When you do one masterpiece at the beginning, that is not because you discovered your language. That's because you are so good, and you're probably a little bit lucky that you got this thing to become a masterpiece. But to develop a language, a structure, a style, I think you need time. You need to forget the audience, but just what you're doing and what you're observing, what you're comparing to other filmmakers. You need to develop and then see the finished product of your film. When I was traveling on the train right now, I was imagining how it is for different people to perceive their finished work. The composer has one experience, the painter has a different experience, and the filmmaker has a very, very particular experience that all his work is actually done for months and months, sometimes years, and then at some point he has to sit 1.5 hours to enjoy that work in 1.5 hours or 2, whatever that may be. But in this case, he must have spent some time looking at the work he did 1, 2, 3, 10 years before, and then slowly but surely a style will be manifested, if you want or not, but something will take shape in some way, which you couldn't have the first 2 years of your work. That I'm assuming that, generally speaking. So I would say that this is Bergman not really there yet in terms of that particular language that he had. We see perhaps a couple of signs of where he was going and why he landed where he landed. To me, it's not typical Bergman. To me, it's not this typical dissected, even though he's playing with time, of course, but the camera work, it's and also it is very surrealistic, where I find I don't recall ever having seen another film of his where I think of surrealism.
I do want to say the one thing about Faces, though. I was really amused by the the pictures on his desk of his family, and they cut to, this is my son, and here's this really stern looking guy frowning directly at the camera. I'm like, damn, that is a harsh face right there.
And it sets up perfectly for the themes of the film, because one of the themes of this film is the intergenerational nature of this cold disposition, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, definitely. When the son is talking about why he doesn't want to have kids, and it's because he was an unwanted child in a hellish marriage. This has affected this guy, who probably would be a much nicer person if not for that, if he had known he was wanted and loved, which gives me hope for the baby at the end, because Marianne wants this baby and doesn't care what her husband says. She wants the baby and she's going to love that baby. And that's going to break the trauma. It's going to break the cycle of trauma.
Can you imagine a Hollywood film being that forward about whether or not they're going to keep a child in 1957?
Hollywood would not have touched that with a 10-foot pole. Nope. Like, it makes me wonder if she's had abortions before because he wanted her to, which is really kind of a depressing thing to think about, honestly. Like, being pressured to not have a child even if you want one, that's fucked up.
Even though a lot of the material that this film covers is harsh, I think Bergman constantly going back to Sjöström's face over and over again softens the blow for us as a viewer. We can feel almost whimsical. Some of the moments that you see are just so cold and so harsh, but there's almost a whimsy about it. I thought of, ironically, it has to do with this film, but I remember watching this film once during a power outage where there was a huge snowstorm outside, and all I had was a single candle, and I had made kind of like this little tent of blankets, and there were drafts in the apartment, and the wind was blowing in, and I was just freezing cold, and I was watching this film on a portable DVD player that ran on batteries, and horrible memory, except this time I was whimsical about it. I remember that as a good time.
Interesting.
At the time, I was like, am I going to make it through the entire night without freezing to death?
Or setting your blanket fort on fire. Candles and blanket forts don't mix that well.
I had the candle outside the blanket fort. The light of the DVD player was enough.
Okay.
The candle, like the boots last week, was purely decorative. This is definitely, I think, Sjöström's film. I think without Sjöström, this film does not work. Now, the real Sjöström was 79 years old, grumpy, and struggled to remember his lines. And there's a story that goes around. I tried to fact check it. It may be true, it may be not, but either way, it bears repeating, that Bergman made a secret pact with Ingrid Thulin, who plays Marianne, his daughter-in-law, that if Sjöström messed up a take, she would apologize and claim it was her fault, just as a way of not embarrassing him and keep the legend from kind of falling off or getting discouraged. Erin, the behind-the-scenes tensions may have shown on screen because their chemistry in the car, that silent, complicated relationship, it almost drives the film in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does, because the characters had complicated relationship as well. So I think that having the unseen, or the unset tension might have helped inform both characters a little bit, make the performances a little bit more believable. That was interesting. That's part of him being cold and having to learn not to be. By having her there when she finally opens up and tells him about the baby and tells him about what his son said and all of that. Those are things he needed to hear, and I think that really helped loosen the tension quite a bit.
And it's really good that is the driving centerpiece of the film, because the fair critique that we've been talking about these 1950s works is the narrative clunkiness.
That's still not as bad as narration. Or a title card saying, and then he fell asleep.
We'll get to Vampire. Don't you worry about a thing.
God, Vampire.
Had Bergman released this in 1957 with the same visual sophistication that he used for his late 60s and early 1970s work, it would have just been considered kind of an experimental film the same way, say, Carl Dreyer's Vampire was a film I realized I liked a lot more than you, Erin. And yeah, I think we would be having a similar discussion about this film to the one we had about Vampire. But speaking of Vampire, we see a strong influence from German Expressionism, and I saw a direct line from Dreyer's Vampire. Yes, I'm going to say it, Erin. I know you hated that movie, but the dream gives us a broken clock with no hands, something that we saw in Vampire. We also see the protagonist actually seeing himself in a coffin, just like Vampire. You obviously liked this film a lot better than you did Vampire. Did Bergman succeed for you or Dreyer fail? How effective was the use of surrealism here to establish Borg's existential dread and self-judgment?
I think it worked better because it was a clearer film, like visually and story-wise. Like for Vampire, I didn't really know what he was trying to do for a lot of it, and it was combining silent film with sound film and with all the title cards, and then you don't know where anything is really taking place, and the film is all blurry, and it's a lot of day for night, which I know is because of the quality of the copy that we're watching. This one was easier to look at. It was visually a lot clearer, and that made it make more sense than something where everything was blurry and I didn't know quite what was going on, and the acting style was so different. Because the acting style in this was, way closer to what I'm used to. It worked, where in Vampire it didn't work. Vampire felt clunky and drawn out. All of the visually interesting things that happened in Vampire were kind of undercut by how clunky and boring the rest of the film was for me. In this, it wasn't
But when you
boring.
saw the clock with no face, and when he opened up the watch that had no hands,
Mhm.
did you immediately, and then you saw him seeing himself in a coffin, did you immediately say, oh, Eric's going to bring Vampire into this?
I didn't, honestly. I didn't think of that. I've been trying to put Vampire out of my mind.
Getting back to just the clock and the watch with no faces, Bergman is setting that up for a later scene where Borg goes to visit his mother, who's an even colder fish than he is, and the mother shows him his father's watch, and the mechanisms work, but the hands are gone. And Borg can't help thinking about his earlier dream. Erin, do you think he was setting up a shorthand for a generational curse of emotional fragility? Is Borg frozen in time?
You could make a good argument for that because it's like the generational cycle I was talking about. His son didn't want to have a kid, but his daughter-in-law did, and she's going to love the child, and the child's going to be okay, most likely, because if he can learn to warm up at his age, his son can learn to warm up because he loves his wife and doesn't want problems with her. That might have given him a heads up about, you need to change. You need to figure out how to change. Because especially with the sound of the clocks ticking throughout the film, having clocks ticking but a watch with no hands is a very odd thing to see. And I think it gave him a bit of a kick in the butt about his own mortality. Even though his mother is old doesn't mean he's going to necessarily outlive her.
And as clunky as their introduction is, the dream sequences in those pictures are very innovative. So that clock with both hands is over an optometrist's office, and you see a pair of glasses with just really big bugged out eyes hanging underneath the clock. You mentioned the man with no face falling over and the blood pouring out of him. All of these things, I think, were quite innovative because they are not surrealist scenes set for the sake of entertainment. So, for instance, Jean Cocteau used fairy tales and ancient myths as his device to kind of spoon-feed his audiences a version of surrealism, Beauty and the Beast and Orpheus. But in Wild Strawberries, the surrealism is psychological. Erin, the dreams are explicitly introduced. I had a dream where. But their role is just as important to understanding Borg's existential journey. Am I right to see Wild Strawberries as kind of a turning point in cinema history? Fairy tale surrealism and the sophisticated subconscious. We later would see this, for instance, in Fellini's works that we haven't covered here yet, but we will, or Bergman's own use in something like Persona. But did you see a future of film? You mentioned David Lynch. Would there be a David Lynch without somebody like Ingmar Bergman doing it first?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it does show a change in filmmaking. And I think it's an important one, too, because as much as we're saying he underestimates the audience with his narration, he's actually showing that he trusts his audience and believes they're smart enough to understand the symbolism of the dreams. And by being able to do that, then he can remove the narration down the road in future films. And other filmmakers can see, oh, this can be a dream thing that means this, and there's symbolism and all that stuff, and actually use that to make more intelligent and meaningful films. Yeah, I think it was pretty important, the dream sequences.
Now, we mentioned that Isaac stops to see his mother, and on the way he stops at a gas station where we see one of Bergman's most frequent collaborators, Max von Sydow, which is pronounced Sydow in its native Sweden. He tells us a different side of Borg as a beloved doctor who took care of the community. Erin, as someone who is relatively new to European cinema, but that's your role on this show, and specifically new to Bergman, were you surprised to see Ming the Merciless from Flash Gordon and Father Lancaster Mirren from The Exorcist in an early movie role before he moved to Hollywood?
A little bit. I saw his name in the credits, so I was like, oh, okay, and I kept looking for him. And it was funny because it was a relatively small but important role. But, I mean, everybody starts somewhere, and if you're starting in Bergman films, that's not a bad place to start. But that was, yeah. I think it's interesting the films that he went on to after he came to America.
We think of him as kind of a very old man in The Exorcist, and you're watching this film that was only made 20 years before it, and you realize that was all makeup. Now, Erin, if the dreams are an expression of Borg's immediate visceral guilt and dread, the flashback sequences are different. They feel real, sunlit, nostalgic, even sweet. The key is that Borg is often an outside observer to the Sarah Siegfried Isaac love triangle, witnessing moments that he wasn't there to see. They are not memories, but subjective, guilt-driven constructs. These sequences don't frame him as the victim. They force him to see himself as the stern, rigid man everyone else sees him as, and see him driving his own happiness away. They are also an explanation for what made him grow up to be so cold and isolated. How do these memory sequences, which feel so real, actually reinforce the same themes of isolation as the nightmares?
What it is by never showing him as his younger self in the flashbacks and seeing how people reacted to him when he wasn't around and how his personality might have affected that and how the family affected his personality. So like seeing his aunt criticizing everyone at the table and how they react to that. Like she's a stand-in for adult Isaac because she's criticizing everything. She's cold.
She's a pet aunt.
She's a pet aunt,
yeah. Pet aunt. Get it?
Yes.
Because she's his aunt.
Boo. Yeah, you can see where the personality came from between his aunt and his mother and himself, all being critical and cold and pushing people away. And then you see how the people that aren't as cold are affected by this behavior. So you see that in the family dynamic early on, and then you see that in, when Marianne is telling him about his son, and when he goes to visit his mother later, and she's still cold, and she's looking at all the toys and calls the picture of her and Isaac and his brother, she calls it rubbish, I think. Like she's going to throw it away. But it's a meaningful memory to Isaac. And he's saying that she doesn't
and it sets up the next scene perfectly where Marianne is berating the family for being not alive, but simply not dead, because that mother clinging on in her 90s is a walking ghost in a way, because it has no spiritual notion, no warmth, no humanity about it.
Yeah, and she says no one comes to visit her, but why would they if there's no love there? If there's no warmth and love to seeing her, why would they come visit?
Grandmas are for spoiling. No wonder her grandkids don't want to be around her. I'm sure the other grandma gives them candy and tells them how beautiful they are.
Right. That's what you want your grandma to do, It's sad that that's the life that she's created for herself. And then he's saying that he's created a similar life for himself, where he doesn't have anyone who wants to come visit or do things with him or anything like that. He doesn't have people who love him. He has people who are beholden to him. Like he has a housekeeper that he hires to be there and take care of him.
She's paid to act like she cares.
Exactly. If he didn't pay her, she wouldn't be there. I don't think she doesn't care. I think that she knows it's a business relationship and that's all it is.
If you weren't being paid to, would you want to spend the afternoon with Isaac Borg?
The actual person, no. And that's what's important to the film, though, is like the actual person is kind of a dick, but that's not who he wants to be, and he's learning not to be that by the end of the film, and I think that's really important too.
the memories and the dream sequences merge because it puts himself on trial in a way.
Mhm.
And that trial scene is where Borg judges himself guilty of indifference. And
Yeah.
it's, I think, a devastating piece of cinematic structure. I know I don't like to use words like masterpiece and devastating, but I think that that sequence is one of the greatest in this film. Where Borg is seeing scenes he couldn't have actually witnessed in life. He's actually watching his late wife cheat on him in a scene where I've read some critics who confused that and thought that it was some form of a sexual assault. It is not. She's simply playing hard to get in 1950s style. And so that's
with her hitting
and that's
him
one of
and
the things
stuff,
that doesn't age well in this film.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely looked like an assault. It felt like an assault, and then she was going to take the blame for it, and that's why he was going to forgive her, because she would have
Yeah,
said it was assault.
we're putting our 2025 view on the events. She went there for a designed assignation with her lover, and then has to play hard to get as part of kind of game that women played at that time in order to, in inverted commas, protect their virtue, which is incomprehensible today.
Yeah, it's pretty fucked up.
And, that part of the scene doesn't date well, but either interpretation of that scene, it's a devastating piece of cinema as far as
I didn't like that scene. It was too ambiguous, I guess, as to whether or not she.
Again, it's only ambiguous in hindsight. It wouldn't
have
been to a 1957 audience.
I know, but I'm still going to see it as somebody in 2025.
I guess what I'm defending myself against is someone coming along on Twitter and saying, "No, you misinterpreted that scene."
No, it's a weird scene, and if it was meant the way you're interpreting it, it says a lot about Bergman, I think, especially now that we know about, because I didn't know before about him being a womanizer and all that. That fits, that interpretation fits the character of the director and of the time. It's still a fucked up scene. I kind of wish there had been a different scene to explain how bad their relationship was, but it's not my film. So
what I liked about the scene is that the guilt is all placed at Borg's doorstep. Her desire to have an affair was because of his own coldness. Her reaction to how she knows he's going to react with coldness, with proper disposition, is all about Isaac's failing, not her failing. This is not a failing of the flesh. It is a failing of Isaac to work on his own marriage. And I will draw a parallel to Bergman, because this was somebody who had 5 failed marriages and, as I mentioned, 9 children by 6 different women, because he always put his career first. He not only made 50-plus films, he worked in the theater and probably more than he did in film. So here he was producing 2 and 3 films a year sometimes, while also mounting 6 or 7 huge theatrical productions. But this is a man who didn't have a lot of time for a love life or his family, but still, for some reason, was driven to sleep with his beautiful leading ladies again and again and again. But I'll tell you what this scene reminded me of, because I happened to have watched this film in high school about the same time that I discovered the music band Pink Floyd, and it was the ending of Pink Floyd's The Wall, where Roger Waters mentally puts himself on trial, and one of the witnesses is his ex-wife, who talks about that he was always cold and never had time to tell her that he loved her. Now, I'm not saying that Waters was affected by Wild Strawberries at all. I'm simply saying I encountered the 2 works simultaneously, and so they're linked in my head. But it is an interesting psychological trick to pull, where you're putting yourself on trial. Sure, the witnesses that you call are going to be maybe less than reliable, and maybe haven't led the most perfect lives, but that doesn't mean that what they have to say is any less important, and that you are less guilty in the events that led up to, in this case, and in The Wall, a lonely, isolated existence. And the question I have for both Pink Floyd, The Wall, and here is Bergman saying that isolation is the sentence or isolation is the crime?
He isolated himself, which caused his future isolation when he didn't want it anymore. And I don't think he realized how much he was isolating himself. And that's, the punishment of voluntarily isolating yourself is being involuntarily isolated later on.
The present journey has two truth tellers, Marianne, his daughter-in-law, whom we discussed, and the hitchhiker Sarah. And the hitchhiker is famously played by the same actor, Bibi Andersson, who played Isaac's childhood Sarah, who we see in the flashbacks. This is similar to how Deborah Carr played multiple roles in Colonel Blimp, but they were all versions of the same character. Another layer of gossip here to Bergman's womanizing. Bibi Andersson was Bergman's real-life mistress at the time, relationship mirroring how Michael Powell, the director of Blimp, was also involved with Deborah Kerr. By the way, 17-year age gap difference in both relationships. Also, a boss abusing his power. 2025 speak. Does this dual casting work for you, and how does it function? Is one considered the immediate truce like Mary Ann, and the other a ghostly reminder of a spontaneous life he rejected? On the other hand, the Sarah of today is also an extremely spontaneous character, and she's very important to the ending of this film. How do you feel about this performance, knowing it's literally being played by a director's 17 years younger mistress?
So this is going to sound bad, but I didn't realize it was the same actor for a while.
They do a good job of making her look different, don't they?
She does look quite different. I went to IMDb to see who Max von Sydow was going to play, and then I saw, oh, she's the same actor. Okay, that makes sense, I guess. But I think it worked because of the ending. I don't know. I like the modern version of her way better than the childhood version. And she had those two guys with the smallest shorts. Why were they wearing such tiny shorts? It was so weird. I think that they had to have the same actor play the two characters so that the ending would work. I think a 17-year age gap is gross, but whatever. It was a different time. Still gross, but more accepted back then. Actually, I think it's pretty accepted now if you're famous enough. Still don't like it. I think it was an interesting choice. I just think it's funny that I didn't realize it until about halfway through the movie, and that's kind of sad.
Well, I think that shows that Bergman did a pretty good job with it.
That's true. And that I'm terrible at recognizing faces.
And that could be it, too. Also, I think I was really familiar with Bibi Andersson from all the other work she's done with Bergman, so maybe that had something to do with it. Like if it had been Max von Sydow twice, you would have noticed. The journey takes a dramatic and even violent turn when Borg nearly runs into a tree and is forced to pick up a truly toxic couple, Alman and Berg, after their own roadside accident. These two, a husband and wife, are engaged in the most vicious, relentless bickering. It's a claustrophobic scene as they're all trapped in that car together, filled with emotional violence that rivals any of the existential nightmares or the flashbacks of Erin. This scene reminded me of August Strindberg. It especially reminded me of the bickering couples in a lot of his works. How effectively does a scene of real-life nastiness contrast with some of the overly theatrical nastiness of Borg's dreams?
I think this is definitely more realistic nastiness. This really hateful couple that it's like they should be divorced. They shouldn't be together. I'm wondering about some of the things he was saying about his wife. She was not a nice person, but when he said that she had everybody convinced she had cancer for 2 years and the doctors couldn't find anything, I guess this was before people knew about medical misogyny, where women just don't get diagnosed for years with things that are real, but the doctors don't care to look, So it felt like he was holding something against her that may not have actually been something she was doing on purpose. But he was just
or
such
a psychological problem that was untreated, which is something that, again, in 2025 eyes, even if she had been lying about that, well, that's a disease too.
Yeah, there would be something that she could be diagnosed with for that.
You bring up a very good irony in this film, which is a lot of it, is, especially in terms of the dream sequences and flashbacks, is about psychology. What we would now diagnose as psychological disorders are seen in every part of this film as character flaws, as some things that we might refer to as post-traumatic stress disorders, such as Borg's strict raising and the way he raised his own son, are seen as genetic character flaws. And again, we're doing this from 2025 eyes with almost 80 years of technological advances and better understanding of psychology. But it is an irony that a film that is so psychologically driven doesn't seem to take that next step and say, and that is a disorder, not a character flaw.
Yeah, that's true. Because I do think that when Borg said he's a pedant, and then it shows him very deliberately lining up his stuff on his desk, there's a little OCD there. And not like the jokey OCD. It's like you have to do things a certain way or the world will implode, kind of an OCD, you know? And being raised by parents like he had, that would give you PTSD. There's a lot of psychology to it. And it's not that he's a bad person. It's just that he has done bad things in his life and he knows that, and he's reflecting on all that throughout the film, and it's helping him change and be better. But yeah, he could have done with a psychiatrist, I think.
Psychologically speaking, Borg is literally stuck in the front seat, forced to listen to this bickering couple, and their bitter verbal sparring and deep destructive resentment. At that moment, I saw this through Borg's eyes, looking in the rearview mirror and recognizing the echoes of his own failed marriage to Karen. And he himself admitted he was a cold fish, a pedant, all the other words that he used. Do you think this was a way of him witnessing his past, or maybe an alternative timeline of what him and Karen could have been if they had simply withdrawn from each other and Karen hadn't died?
I think it's definitely an eye-opener for him to see what his marriage would have looked like from the outside, especially when his own son described his parents' marriage as hellish. Yeah, I think seeing these two be so awful to each other was definitely a wake-up call for him. And for Marianne also, which is why she kicked him out of the car, which I'm glad she did, because they were terrible, terrible people.
She does that for the sake of the children, she says. But Marianne is having her own problems that we talked about. But yeah, you're right. She finally just draws the line. But she's struggling with her own marriage. You know, Evolve, Borg's son, doesn't want the child that she's pregnant with. And the couple's fighting and viciousness can't not be a reflection of what's going on in her own home.
In this couple, these three different parties are seeing the intensity, the stupidity, the lack of respect, the lack of decorum, the lack of reality that these two are doing a show with. It's just amazing what it's really amazing what these people did. When you consider the very, very high society of these people, the country, the culture of this country is very, very fixed, very attached to decorum. He is a doctor, so he's very, very well aware of how he's supposed to behave. His daughter-in-law, of course, because of her position and her education and her culture, she's very... The young people are also paying their respects to the old man, and everybody is very, very conscientious about the importance of respect in that culture. And these two are completely off. But at the same time, they're playing that explosion with a certain understanding of how to respect each other, which is why they tend to be very sarcastic, especially him. So it's a very interesting combination of, I'm going to shit all over the place now, and at the same time, I have to be very proper about how I do that.
And now, Gummo Bergman's Silent Strawberry.
Dear, dear, behold,
The narration says, in my dream I walked in the garden of my grandfather as I did in childhood. Suddenly, a serious figure appeared. He says, I am the angel of death.
I think the second half or the last third of the film is bringing him to the point of redeeming powers, namely accepting and learning to enjoy whatever failures and whatever joys he had, even though he did not understand them as a young person or later on or even 3 years ago. But at some point now, he's realizing actually he can be, and he should be thankful for the fact that he knew this girl back then, even though he didn't get her.
Let's contrast this work with Akiru. Watanabe was isolated by bureaucracy. Isak Borg is isolated by choice. Does that make Isak a more tragic or frustrating figure? His life was wasted by himself, not the system. We'll start with you, Erin Brown.
A more frustrating figure because you don't have to stay isolated. You can change that. Allow yourself to open up and see the world around you and recognize people and recognize what's good and what's not and recognize what's good and bad in yourself and work on fixing that. Of course, a lot of times that takes therapy.
But Watanabe does that by building the park.
Yeah, he found a goal. He found something to work toward. I don't think Isak has that other than just try to bring his family back and be a warmer person. It's a bit of a harder journey if you don't have a destination in mind, I think. Because I don't know if Watanabe would have changed if he hadn't found out he was dying and realized he wanted to do one good thing for the world before he went.
As the one good bureaucrat in Akira points out, we're all dying. We could all die at any minute.
That's true, but for Watanabe, it was much more immediate. He knew for a fact it was happening and going to happen soon, within a year. So that gave him the impetus to try to make a mark in the world. Isak doesn't have that. For all he knows, he'll live into his 90s like his mother. Yeah, he's solving problems that are mostly of his own making. I mean, I can't really blame him for being traumatized by his family. His parents were not amazing, looks like. I don't know. We don't know anything about his father, but his mother was very cold.
Time has stopped for them.
But it hasn't stopped for him. He can keep going and keep moving, so he still has time to change.
Yeah, so what if he's led a cold and isolated life? He treats his maid better now, and his daughter-in-law gives him a kiss on the forehead when he goes to bed.
I'm not saying he's 100% better now, but he's taking the first steps down the road to not being a dick.
Sila Blume, same question.
I do not really see either of them being isolated. Ikuru is put in place by his society, which the Japanese society has a very, very strict system as to what you're supposed to do, and you're not supposed to get out of line. So basically, he's serving the way a Japanese is supposed to serve, be it on a very high post or a very low post. Borg is actually on a pedestal by society. So I think they're both dealing with the same thing, basically, but without being isolated. They're both dealing with who am I and why am I doing this and how much can I allow my life to be a suffering one, or how much freedom do I have to, and for which reason, and how long do I wait? Like I said before about Borg, how long do I wait to wake up and do things, even if I'm still doing that job for the government? I think they're prisoners.
Go back, Sila,
yeah.
Go back to the scene where he dreams that he's basically putting himself on trial, the kind of Pink Floyd The Wall moment. He's found guilty of something. Is it indifference, isolation? There's some moment in that where he is finding himself guilty of not having led the right life. What is the guilt that is driving this? What is driving the nightmares? What is driving the flashbacks? If it isn't his coldness and indifference and isolation, what is he guilty of?
Yeah, of being lazy, of having not paid attention. As I said at the very beginning, he did not pay, and that's actually my point when I opened up. why do humans wait so long to wake up? Especially with the memories of Sarah, he might be thinking, wow, all the time I wasted being bitter and then marrying someone else, why did I wait so long? Because in his life, nothing has changed. Only his attitude has changed. So why didn't he enjoy that before? It's not that he's indifferent. He was focused on other things. He was more busy with his frustration that he didn't get the woman. And let's not forget, his mother is a piece of work. So we cannot say that he was not affected by the mother he has. She is
well, and this ties into what Bergman said about his own Nazi sympathies as a child, being raised by a cold pastor.
Yeah. I mean, she's a general. And, but again, like I said before, that is part of this society. Decorum, what are you, she's not supposed to do this. Who is that woman? Well, a very bad general.
We finally see the ceremony, though, he's been traveling to. It's a rather cold and empty affair. Isaac may have inherited his family's attachment, but academia itself seems to be a dour bunch of cold fish, especially in competition with the young hitchhikers who get into fistfights over arcane philosophy. Was this Bergman's jab at academic life, or the actual coldness of Swedish society? Was Borg born this way, or made so by his chosen profession? We start with Erin Brown.
I think it's possible he went into medicine because of how cold and detached he is. I think he chose that profession because it fit his personality.
But the ending of the film is gentle. Marianne has spent the entire film berating him for his coldness and admits some newfound admiration for him. Sarah appears under his window barefoot and jokingly says he is the man she truly loves, which is doubly meaningful with Anderson playing both Sarahs, because of course the Sarah in the flashback was Isaac's long-lost love. He finds peace in the final dream of his parents at the water. Sila, does Isaac actually truly make amends, or just accept what has happened? Has he truly fixed anything, or just found peace with his own failures?
It seems to me that the whole film is dealing with him being presented either through nightmares or through contact to this young girl and her friends, or the revelations through his daughter-in-law. He is being confronted from different directions with how to take a stand with what he was and what he wants to be, or what he wants to become before he dies, and trying to do the best with what he has now. He has been given a lot of warmth and humor, and he has felt much lighter when they're out there on that table having some food and wine. And also the couple that is fighting in the car, they have given him also a wake-up call. So to me, he's just really enjoying reasons to say, I could deal with this. I could still, if it is another year or another week, I could still enjoy life as it is now, including to get this wonderful compliment from the young girl. He's the one I love.
Erin Brown, same question.
I think by the end of the film he has found peace, but it leaves him open to making changes to continue finding peace with who he is and who he wants to be. Because it's never too late to figure out what you want in life and how you want to be. And I think they've left it at a place where he can do that.
And now let's address the core question of this entire series on aging in 1950s cinema. Why did so many great masters make pictures on mortality and aging in the 1950s? We covered Ikiru, and now Wild Strawberries. We're going to be covering Umberto D later in this series, and we're going to be finishing it off with Ozu's great film Tokyo Story. Was there something about that time that made people intensely aware of mortality and legacy, the bomb, the baby boom, perhaps a new prosperity allowing more reflective works? In this particular case, maybe it was the ulcer-inducing stress. Bergman wrote this script while hospitalized for his gastrointestinal issues. We'll start with Sila Blume.
I think any time after the war, let's say 15 to 20 years after the war, and of course the fact that he was hospitalized for a serious problem, the reflections on life, which is of course what Borg is doing, or being forced to do. I think that period of the war has just finished, and what are we left with? I think that might be a very strong reason to deal with that. I have never known life like that. I've always been in very comfortable situations my whole life, free countries and everything. But I imagine I got some of that in Germany, Netherlands, comments and people that I met. A friend of mine was actually 1 or 2 years after his birth. He was in the hospital and he was not able to go home, which was just 2 blocks from the hospital, until he was 2 or something like that. And another one from Aachen told me about his experience remembering how his mother takes him abruptly out of the baby carriage, throws him on the floor, and throws herself on top of him. So I've known some stories of people who went through that as children. The spirit is, as a result, very, very much alive 15, 20 years later in people who went through it, or children that heard about it, or you don't get rid of that that quickly. So I think that's a good reason for a lot of artists, creative people to be thinking about what have we just gone through, and how do we fix it? How do we appreciate what we have now on a different level? Which could be applied to our thinking after COVID.
Erin Brown.
You had World War One, you had the Depression, you had World War Two. So you had 3 decades of just trying to survive. And then in the 50s, with the prosperity after that, it wasn't a life or death struggle every day. It was, you actually can live comfortably and do what you want, and you have enough food, and you can, you're going to be fine. So it gave them more time to think about, what is the purpose of life? When you're just trying to live, you're not thinking about why. You're just thinking you have to live. So I think it was a lot of that. And people have more time to study and go to school and just learn about philosophy and existence. So, yeah, I think it was very much a peacetime thing.
And let's tie this into our series theme, Watanabe in Akiru, found meaning in public gesture. Isak Borg finds peace in private realization. Erin, we'll start with you. Which approach to confronting mortality, public gesture, or private acceptance felt more resonant to you today?
I think the contemplation Isak was dealing with about, just figuring out who you are, what you want to do with your life, what is the purpose of it. And it might be because I'm American of European descent and not Japanese, so it's a different culture and different things are necessary, societally. But yeah, figuring out who you are and who you want to be is pretty important to me, I think.
Sila Blume, in Akiru, we actually see a physical manifestation of Watanabe's change. We see the park. In this film, it is psychological. Which one affected you?
I appreciate both, but for my type of being, my way of looking at life, I find Ikuru a little bit too Hollywood-esque, too nice. I'm going to do this for the human being.
A Wonderful Life-ish?
Yes, it's a little bit, let's get some popcorn and bubblegum. And for me, the Borg situation is a lot more analytical, more existential questions about what I have done, where Ikuru is only, or Watanabe is only giving like a compensation to society, so things go better later. He can be nice in return, but to me that is, I welcome both, but the Borg situation is more in tune with my way of thinking in the, like I said at the beginning, the analysis of what I am and why am I, that I find a lot more important.
I'm going to agree with both of you here. I think Akiru was the better made film. It had a much more sophisticated narrative style, but the actual meaning to me of Wild Strawberries is something I think about a lot more, and I think it raises and answers questions that are deeper and more meaningful. The narrative clunkiness of it makes it so that if I were to say, which film did I want to rewatch tonight, it would probably be Akiru because it is a better made film. On that note, Erin Brown, your final thoughts on Wild Strawberries?
I'm glad this was my introduction to Bergman. I didn't know what to expect. Like I said before, I've seen parodies and stuff, so I didn't know how out there this was going to be, and it was not. It was very relatable and straightforward and made a lot of sense. And his journey was interesting. I do think I agree with you, though, that I'd rather watch Akiru if I had to choose. I don't know. I just liked it a little better, but I think it was, very good. I'm glad I watched it.
Yeah, there's something to be said about a slick production and watchability. I think that's something we talk about quite often on the show, but we should probably talk about more, that watchability, it should be a factor in how great a film is. Sila Blume, your final thoughts on Wild Strawberries?
After these discussions or these conversations, for the most part, I have the need to watch the film again because of the things that I hear or the things that I think about during the conversation. And that's most of what I'm thinking right now, the desire to be able to watch it again. Desire to be able, because I know I will not do that because I have other things to do. I have a very difficult time repeating a film within a couple of days. The repetition of watching either of these films, I appreciate both very highly, because one is they're both displaying heavily. Not only they're depicting two individuals in their situation, very personal situations, but they're also both depicting very strongly how these societies work, how their cultures are, and this submission that is prevalent in Japan, and this different submission that is typical in Sweden, namely, you are supposed to be very attentive to decorum. You're supposed to. They're very. It's not a loose society. I find Indonesia, for example, things are taken a lot more loosely. Germany, even, I would say, is very different. But even though Germany is very comparable to Japan, but I find the Japanese are very, very harsh in every structure they have, and you're not supposed to go outside of it. So I think I cannot choose one as more desirable to rewatch than the other.
One of the themes of this film that we didn't talk about for time reasons was nostalgia. For me, the picture creates nostalgia for a time when features were well made and made for adults, by adults, and dealt with sophisticated subjects. While the narrative structures of some of these works were made for a simpler time and maybe uncomplicated or even clunky, the existential subject matter was deeper and more meaningful. The innovations of the 1960s and 70s arguably came at a price, as pictures were made by and aimed at younger and younger people. As the filmmaking became more complex, the films themselves seemed to be regressing into childhood. Before we wrap up, Erin, where can listeners find you on the internet?
I am on Blue Sky at Toad Puppy, and I'm on YouTube at Pizza Horse Productions.
And where can they find us on the internet?
And they can find us at ko-fi.com/world cinema history. We've got our whole back catalog up there, and just come and check it out. It's a lot of fun.
And Sila Blume, where can people find your goings on online?
Most of it, although I'm a little bit lazy at the moment, most of it is done on silablume.life.
And you can find World Cinema History on all the podcast platforms as well as YouTube. And keep up with our series there at the ko-fi.com/World Cinema History. And you can find me on Twitter at Trommater. Next time, we'll continue our series on aging and mortality in 1950s cinema, discussing Vittorio De Sica's portrait of economic isolation, Umberto D, and we will finish the series with Yasushi Ozu's Tokyo Story. Thank you for joining us on World Cinema History.
TikTok!